Ioana Pelehatăi. I'm an editor of Rezidența9. And next to me is Peter Pomerantsev. Now, I'm sort of sure he needs no introduction. I love that cliche, but I'm going to do it anyway. He was born in Kiev during Soviet times in a family of Russian-speaking Jews who then fled to Western Germany. They wound up in London after a while, where he spent part of his schooling years, then on to Munich, and eventually from 2001 to 2010, worked in Russia, largely in television production. He's a journalist, he's an author of 3 books. The first one is Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, The Surreal Heart of the New Russia, 2014. The second one is This Is Not Propaganda, Adventures in the War Against Reality, 2019. And the third one that was published last year is How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. Now, we're super lucky in Romania and Moldova. Editura Cartier from Moldova has translated and published all of these books, and you can find them at the back on the table to purchase tonight. From journalist, Peter then pivoted to academia, and he's now working and living in the United States as a senior lecturer for Johns Hopkins. That about sums it up, right?
Yeah.
All right. Peter, we're going to start off by sort of exploring the universe of your latest book, about the guy who managed to trick Hitler. I'll say that it reads as a political thriller. It's got some surprising humorous bits. I wasn't expecting to read a book about Nazis and sort of chuckle every now and then. And there's a cautionary tale part to it as well, but we'll get to that later in the conversation. I'll start with a basic question. How did you discover this guy who's your protagonist, Sefton Delmer, and what drew you to him? As a sort of bonus coda to that question, there's something about his biography and his skipping around the map and his, being stuck between worlds, not knowing if he's Britain in Germany, is he a German in Britain, what is he? That I think draws some parallels to your own biography, and I was wondering if that was part of the appeal or if it was something else altogether.
No, it was totally that. But I've written 2 books about propaganda. I study and teach about it at university. So, at events like this, people would come up to me and say, you write about Russia's an authoritarian disinformation manipulation. But did you know that actually we were really good at it as well in the Second World War? And I first started discovering Sefton Delmer as kind of, Britain's tradition of disinformation. To the extent that he's remembered for creating these kind of fake news radio stations, but to undermine Hitler in the Second World War. So stations that would pretend to be Nazi, but weren't actually Nazi. So would pretend to be Nazi, but would undermine the Nazis by saying, I'm a patriotic Nazi, but have you heard this horrible rumor about Goering's penis? And a lot of pornography, a lot of black humor. And when I first started to read about him, I read about him as sort of, an example that, we do just the sort of things that we accuse the other side of doing in the Romanian election. And I found that medium interesting. I found it curious. It was a time of war when kind of all bets are off in many ways. But I had no desire to write about him. I was like, fine, it's a little bit of historical trivia. And then I started to read his memoirs. And as I read them, I kind of realized that the way he'd been remembered, and he's barely remembered, but the way he's been remembered by specialists completely missed the point. And there was this bit when I was reading about his memoirs of the Second World War, where he was running this vast propaganda operation, dozens of radio stations. 40% of Germans were listening to them. based out of this beautiful country house in Bedfordshire, surrounded by paintings by Holbein and Van Dyck, and recruiting the stars of the German cabaret scene to play Nazis, many of them Jews, playing Nazis to undermine the Nazis, working with these incredible novelists, with Ian Fleming, with Muriel Spark, with this incredible array of talent, which is already quite interesting. But the moment I realized I might write a book about it was when he said that from 1943, he wanted the Germans to know that this was the British playing Nazis. And then I was like, what? Because that's not what the Russians are trying to do. You know, the Russians are trying to, you know, do fake news that is deceptive. He was doing a sort of cabaret where he wanted the audience to know that he was putting on a mask. And I was like, whoa, what the hell is going on here? And then I went back and read about his life, his childhood. And he'd grown up in Germany as a child to British parents, then moved to England when he was a teenager. And growing up, he kind of saw cultural identities as theatre that you inhabit, and that the propagandists can manipulate. And that propaganda was about manipulating and creating identities and giving people satisfying roles to play, which he was hyper aware of because he'd switched identities so many times. And really what he was doing in a very instinctive way, because he wasn't a great theorist, but he was just moving towards this all the time in his work, was undermining the identity that the Nazis had given people. And he had what he was doing was incredibly sophisticated and nothing like what the Russians or the Nazis were doing, but also nothing like liberal media. He was a very contemporary character, I realized, because he had a problem with German opposition media, which was now in exile, which was still preaching from abroad to Germans to believe in social democracy and the virtues of liberalism when Germans were enraptured with Hitler. And he was like, this is ridiculous. And he was scathing about the German service of the BBC, which was lecturing Germans about how evil Hitler was, when he was like, but they're in love with Hitler. This is ridiculous. So he thought liberal media was in an echo chamber, which is very similar to the problem we have today. And he thought you had to sort of burst into the psychological filter bubble that the Nazis had created and explode it from inside.
I think this would be an interesting thing to speak of as well. In the book, you talk about how the Nazis, without necessarily theorizing too much themselves, they're appealing to this ethos of Germany having been greatly humiliated, and how they're also peddling on something that Svetlana Boim calls, let me check my notes, a type of nostalgia that's restorative, which, hey, where did we hear that in recent times? Maybe make America great again, or maybe make Romania completely autonomous from Western influences again. So there's this, very interesting mechanism where these people in power are saying, this is an approximate quote from your book, when the people in power say they're feeling humiliated, what they're actually saying is how they're gonna inflict violence on their opponents. Would you like to expand on this, mechanism of creating allegiance?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think when we're talking about the power of propaganda and storytelling, the language of geopolitics is really just the projection of psychological needs and manipulations. I mean, even this idea that, we've been humiliated and therefore we need to humiliate others. I mean, it's fascinating reading psychoanalysts who are, some of whom were working with Delmo. Delmo actually employed the first professor of psychoanalyst from Cambridge, Canadian guy, to work with him. But the psychoanalysts who looked at the sort of the Nazi crowd in general were like, wow, how, you know, this idea of grievance, they theorized, was because we all have grievance, you know, from a very young age. We feel, you know, dejected or hurt or somehow spurned by our parents. Each of us has a voice within us that is putting us down, you know, the voice that criticizes ourselves. And here you get to flip that voice onto somebody else. I mean, look, we can go further and further into sort of, you know, Melanie Klein and the idea of, you know, the mother that you want to control and the mother that rejects you as being all your enemies. It doesn't matter which particular theory you choose. I think the point is that propaganda answers deep, deep psychological needs. Yeah, and Delmo isn't a strict Freudian, but he definitely understands that propaganda is filling deep personal needs, which it maps geopolitics onto. So all the stuff about make America great again or make Romania great again, we're really talking about our deeply personal needs. The need to belong, the need to humiliate, the need to feel superior, and the language can change. And there isn't, you know, of course there's historical grievances that you may have, but really we're talking about something very, very personal that sits in every one of us. I mean, I think with regimes like Russia's, they produce humiliation, you know, they generate humiliation towards their own population. The population learns to internalize that over many, many decades, learns to normalize it, learns to say they enjoy it, you know. Oh, give us a silna ruka, give us a strong hand. We need a Stalin, we need someone to punish us, which is kind of a textbook definition of masochism. You know, the abused starts to normalize the abuse, to live with it, and then of course wants to, you know, push it onto somebody else as well. So yes, it's a personal thing, then regimes get involved in that personal relationship, become both the creator of the humiliation and the compensation of the humiliation. Anyway, in that whole cauldron of fucked up feelings is where propaganda can operate.
I mean, you've previously said that you can call it talking to the id or talking to the pig dog.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Delmo was doing.
Well, Delmo was saying, look, you've got to work with these very, very strong emotions, with sexual urges. So a lot of what he was doing was pornographic to an extent. But really, I think instinctively he understood that you're not going to break the monopoly of the fascists on strong feelings without going to the strongest feelings there are, which are sex, anger, fear. You have to be there. You have to be tapping into them and then doing something very different with them. You know, his aim was to immerse audiences in those feelings, to distance them from the Nazis, firstly, and we can talk about how he thought about that, but then to actually finally take control for yourself, not to follow the propagandist, the Goebbels, or whoever else who was like a cult leader using people's trauma and desire for their own ends, but maybe a bit more like a therapist, bringing all that out, finding who was actually guilty for your suffering, which in this case was the Nazi leadership, identifying that, and essentially giving you the opportunity to take back control of your own life, which in the context of the war meant defecting from the army, not following Nazi orders, not taking part in Nazi events, not taking part in the Nazi economy. So, you know, his aim was for people to break the bond and the emotional power the Nazis had, and to get people to abandon them and think about their own self-interest, think about their own agency, think about what's good for them and not what's good for Hitler. That's not a high appeal. That's not an appeal to their liberalism or their democracy. It's like, why the fuck do you need this guy? It's that. Like, are you sure you want to go and die for this? Are you sure you want to go and vote for this? Because it's not in your interest. But to get to the point where you can say that, you've got to break the emotional bond. And that means going to the same urges of aggression, anger, desire, and belonging that the Nazis were experimenting with too.
Yeah, I was going to add that you write that propaganda is a remedy for loneliness.
I didn't write that. Jacques Ellul writes that. I quote him, but fine.
Well, okay, there are words in your book that are...
They're quotes, yeah.
So, you know, other than appealing to these super basic emotions, he's also giving people a sense of community. And this is where I would like to come back to today and gestures vaguely everything that's going on in the world. Obviously, we cannot and would be ill-advised to replicate Delmer's methods, but what can...
You just wrote a book saying we should, but okay.
Well, I mean, you also advised in the beginning that we should not, you know, do this word for word. But like, you were talking on a podcast recently about how much more data we have today and how we can use some pages from his playbook to do this. Care to tell us how?
Yeah, look, I mean, Delmer was working during the war, firstly. We're not always in the middle of a war. Different cost-benefit analysis apply, you know. So, you know, it's different working in a democracy to a war. But in terms of doing stuff into Russia, we should totally be doing what he did. We don't need to... So Delmer sometimes used disinformation, but only because, like, he didn't always have the information. He actually had a huge research department, because his aim was to describe the lives of Nazi soldiers and civilians better than the Nazis. So most of his effort was research. Most of his effort was finding out what were they pissed off about. Corruption at the mid-level. What diseases were being, you know, sucked up at the brothel in Calais. He was getting information from partisans. He was opening the letters that Nazi officials were sending. He was putting microphones inside prisoner of war camps to listen to the jokes that people were telling each other. He wanted to know the jokes that they were making. To create these radio stations that would sound more genuine of people's lives than the Nazi stations. He was going to say, like, I know your lives better than the Nazis. I can imitate and twist and replicate Nazi language better than the Nazis. And thus creating this kind of gap between the Nazi audience and the Nazis. Yeah? So we can do that so much better now. We can know what people care about through online sentiment analysis much better than Delmer ever could have. And everybody does. This is what everybody does who's working on social media for good reasons or for bad reasons. They know exactly what is getting people's emotions up. We have so much more data about corruption throughout mid-level Russian officials or officers. So we have way more information than before. So there's no excuse not to be able to communicate with people. You don't need to replicate in a democracy, you know, you don't need to replicate media the way he did. I mean, he was partly imitating Nazi media so closely to give people kind of a sense of safety. So in case the Gestapo came in, you could say, I thought this was a Nazi station, sir. It just said they were Nazis, even though you were meant to know they're not. So you don't need to do that in a democracy. But totally we should be, somebody should be creating stations for, you know, I don't know, somebody described it as redneck radio in America. Of course they should be. Of course we should be creating media for the audiences that are currently only feeling that, you know, that Trump is listening to them or whoever is listening to them. Of course we should be talking to those audiences. So you don't need to go as far as Delmer to disguise or to play this game of disguise. Though if you're doing it into Russia or China, then you probably should. You should probably say, yes, we're the Russian Armed Services radio, even though the soldiers know that you're not, to give people some safety. So, but in terms of understanding the audience, instead of understanding their angers, understanding their frustrations, being unafraid to dive into that world and into that language, I think we should learn from him.
There are many thoughts going through my head right now, but I'll settle on this one. Post-presidential elections in Romania, which, as you now know, came as a huge shock for the liberal part of society, people started saying, well, we should talk to the people who voted for them. And other people in liberal circles were saying, well, I don't want to talk to potential fascists, I don't want to talk to potential neo-Nazis. And they started talking about the paradox of tolerance, you know, like what's the limit to which you can talk to these people, or do you believe such a limit exists in the first place?
No, but listen, these are different things. Delma wanted to destroy the other side. Yeah, of course you should have a forum which rejects people who don't want to be part of democracy. I mean, that's, you know, the old, you know, the paradoxes that Karl Popper talked about. That's fine. Delma wasn't doing talking to. Delma was doing destroying the propaganda machine of the other side and blowing it up so that you could have a chance to talk to somebody or not talk to somebody. He was doing something much more warlike. I mean, he was literally in a war. So no, of course there's, and I've written about it in my second book a lot, of course there's a need to create a different type of fora which are cleverer at integrating social debates into the agora of modern democracy, and we need new types of online platforms that do all those things and deal with those paradoxes. Delma's doing something else. Delma is like saying, okay, here is the weak spot of the enemy. This is where the split is between the really hardcore fascists and the fash-adjacents, and I'm going to split that and paralyze them. That's what he's doing. He's doing, you know, he's creating the conditions where we can start to have an agora.
You employed this metaphor in your keynote speech this morning that was organized by Expert Forum, where you likened the internet to a city that should have, it should have shopping malls, the likes of which Meta and X and TikTok are providing us with, but it should also have an agora and places that serve a public function. But then I think, you know, the question that arises is who's gonna do that? Who's gonna regulate that? Could it be too late for that? Could European governments and authorities, to just talk about Europe, be a bit castrated in the face of, you know, the opaque algorithms and business interests of various, you know, actors?
It is. I mean, personally, I fear it is too late, which is why I've written a book about the next stage, which is just war. It's like either literal war. I mean, I'm from Ukraine, so the war for me is not abstract. It's very like. Well, I was born in Ukraine. I'm from Britain, but I spend 50% of my time there, and so, you know, for me, Ukraine is a model of what we're going to be seeing a lot of, as you know, as a lot of things that we thought were forever collapse in front of our eyes. There'll be a lot more of literal war and a lot more of hybrid war, and it'll be pretty Hobbesian, and then we definitely need our Seft and Delma vision, where it's about survival. At the same time, of course, we need to be developing and building the democracy of the future, even as a tiny model of how it can be. So we'll have to do both at the same time. Both fight information wars and at the same time develop transparent models of internet regulation and new online forums that stimulate debates and that don't suck up your data, and new kind of online town halls where democracy can flourish. We're going to somehow have to do it at the same time. It's that kind of world that we live in. I mean, it is. We're still struggling to define it, aren't we? But you have to do both at the same time. You have to both build the beautiful city of democracy while fighting these crazy battles at the same time.
Yes, I think we are struggling to define this, and this reminds me of something else that you wrote about in your second book, about sort of the collapse of meaning of words that we were in the habit of using when describing politics, you know, like left and right and democracy and socialism, and like I personally, as an elder millennial, struggle with this. I mean, you know, I was brought up in the 90s where, you know, there was all this American soft power and Western soft power in general coming to Eastern Europe. And I don't know how to make sense of a world where these words don't make sense anymore. Like, got any advice for me?
No, I'm in the same place as you. I actually think that this sort of space is very important, because when we're talking about, you know, the collapse of an architecture of meaning, I was just in Moldova and interviewed the president, Maya Sandu, who was really like the articulation of that idea of sort of Western democracy. You know, she comes from a sort of, you know, she comes from a father who was very against Soviet corruption. She believes very much in the, you know, in the post-Cold War institutions that were meant to bring democracy, European integration. She worked at the World Bank. All these kind of institutions which, for worse or better, were meant to secure an idea of democracy locked in a transatlantic democratic relationship. And it was really interesting interviewing her, because she's such a symbol of that and a product of it, and her just saying, but a lot of these tools aren't keeping up with the new world. You know, we have all this language. She's thinking more about laws and regulation and Venice commissions and courts trying to withstand sort of this tsunami of Russian hybrid war, which descends on Moldova, and how hard it is to, well, how you can't use them to compete with that, you know. And the language as well, you know, we have all this beautiful language which doesn't feel active anymore. So it's a crisis of imagination, which is why I do think this sort of space is so important, because we start to win again by going back to storytelling, by working out what was the sort of, you know, what was the meaning of these meanings before they became empty words, before they became things that could be so easily manipulated, before liberalism was hijacked by identitarian far-right parties who now say they are going to cleanse Europe of all brown people in order to save liberalism. I mean, before the whole thing became totally perverse and unrecognizable, what was it meant to be? And I think that starts with going back to theatre, to art. That's what regenerates it over and over and over. It's what America so needs. I mean, America's last regeneration comes with the civil rights movement from inside and this wave of incredible writers and artists from Eastern Europe, sort of reinventing America, making it re-understand its ideas of freedom. I mean, America desperately needs that now. But here as well. So I think it has to start with the arts. Or else you just have Elon Musk saying he's for freedom of speech. But he seems to really not be somebody who instinctively fights for democracy. And I kind of imagine Elon Musk, who would have been in the 30s or the 50s, or if he'd been here in the 70s, and I'm just not quite sure that he would have been a dissident. Yeah, we have to go back to the beginnings, and I think that's done through art. I mean, my second book was all about that. It was about the competition between poetry and propaganda, and the way propaganda eats up language and perverts it, and how the poet always has to be ahead of it, recreating language. I mean, it's still about freedom. It's still about these things, but we have to completely go back to finding a language and a story for that again.
Because you mentioned this, I know you briefly mentioned it this morning as well, but I'm still going to bring it up because it's my favorite moment in your second book. You're talking about your father's poetry and how it has transformed from this sort of, everything is centered on self-expression and the individual, and toward, like later in life, you mentioned this text that's super poetic, but his voice is not present there. It's about types of wind, if I'm not mistaken, but it's about freedom at the same time.
Yeah, so in the book, sort of, I start with my father's poetry in the 60s and 70s, growing up in Chernovitz in Greater Romania, according to Hirhescu, but in Ukraine for the moment. A long moment, I hope. So growing up in Chernovitz and writing this very modernist poetry in the 60s and 70s, and it's all about the I. You know, in a time when social realism was being imposed by the state, he was writing this incredibly, I mean, very I-centered, quite narcissistic poetry, but which was very rebellious then. It's all about me and very impressionistic, you know, very stream of consciousness. And then he emigrates in 78, lives in West Germany, then London, and there is no struggle for the I. And it's interesting how he stops using it, because it's kind of vulgar. And there's no freedom associated with going me. And he moves away from the self. And yeah, he has this lovely stuff. I think it's from the 90s already. It's a beautiful story. It's a dictionary of winds, just describing different types of wind, all about freedom, but never does he mention the I or the self anymore, because there's nothing liberating in 1990s Western Europe saying me. If anything, you know, it's kind of a little bit slavish.
Yeah, there are a few Romanian cultural figures that haven't gotten that memo yet, but, you know.
I struggle with modern jazz nowadays. I love it, but I'm like, oh my God, it's just a guy going me on a saxophone. I'm like, can you stop it now? I understand why jazz was so revolutionary in the 60s. I completely get it. But like, even jazz, which I love, but we listen to it as a museum piece, so it's fine. You know, it's nostalgia. It's not monstrous nostalgia. It's the nice nostalgia. Yeah. She talks about nice nostalgia as well.
I know.
We're aware of the difference. We don't try to bring the 1960s back.
I have two favorites, Svetlana Boim and Svetlana Alexievich. I quite like her writing on nostalgia. But to go back, you just spoke of the important role of the artist, and I'm here with you, but I'm a journalist. And there's several instances in your books, this third one and the second one, where there are journalists, Delmer himself included, who are, let's say, forced by circumstance to step outside of their role or overstep some boundaries or place some boundaries in order to preserve that role of a journalist and not become an activist or a propagandist. Or do you still think that's possible in this day and age, even in a democracy, but mind you, a democracy kind of teetering on the brink to something else?
So look, journalism has transformed many times over its like 200 odd year history. I mean, you can go back to Herodotus if you want to be pretentious, but like, you know, it's really with the emergence of a Enlightenment public sphere that it starts to emerge. The idea of objectivity emerges in the 20s and 30s as a reaction to different types of propaganda, and journalists say, oh, we are for objectivity. These are all things that shift around. But what we're really talking about is the relationship between information and democracy, and what is our role in it. And of course there's a role for the Associated Press or this sort of pure journalism which pretends to be outside of any kind of politics. And I respect that. I just don't think it's enough anymore. I don't think people necessarily trust that anymore. So in a way, we have the worst of all worlds. Let's take the US election. You ended up having liberal biased media that was soft on Biden because they were so scared of Trump, but neither were they kind of activist enough to really, if you're going to be anti-Trump, do it properly. So they were soft on Biden, then try to be balanced, really made a mess of like, you know, the fact that Biden was going senile. They weren't nearly critical enough on that. They were soft on him, and at the same time, so they didn't play their role as holding the powerful to account. At the same time, in their critiques of Trump, just try to do, oh, he's just another candidate. No, if you think he's a threat to democracy, fine, go and do that. So they ended up being neither nor. and it was unhelpful. And now they're just being decimated because their bosses want to suck up to Trump. So, look, I think there's a role for the purist journalist who is, I am against everyone, I am just for truth and objectivity, that's fine. I think we need a new type of journalism whose job it is to generate trust with audiences by essentially playing the role of social services, engagement journalism, which is being developed a lot at the City University of New York. They have a whole faculty. That's putting objectivity to the side. That's saying my role is to listen to people's concerns and try to get them the information that helps them make their lives better. And I'm doing that so the propagandists don't do that. I'm going to, that is saying I am competing with the propagandists who are going to say they're the solution. I'm going to say, no, I think this sort of civic media can play the role of defending citizens around water pollution in Michigan or something. And that is my role. My role is to go and find out what people care about, not what I care about, what they care about, and seeing how I can help them deal with those issues, because that is the only way we're going to get there before the propagandists get there and say, I am your solution to all your problems. So that's a different type of journalism. It's still research, it's still writing, it's still getting evidence, but it's completely put the idea of being balanced, out of the window. So we can go on and on and on. I mean, there's just so many new things to do. And then there's the sort of thing that Delma did in the war, which is thinking about the vulnerability of the propagandists' audiences and just going in there and disrupting it. So a disruptive role. So these are all new things that will emerge. They can all be still based on actually transparency. They can also be based on getting evidence. They can also be based on storytelling. They can also be based on playing a kind of empowering the audience. So in that sense, they can all still have journalistic patterns to them, but they're completely different in their theory of, objectivity, fairness, all that stuff they get beyond. And then there's a place for what I've always been most interested in, but which is creating the public space where the debate happens, which is what the BBC was created for. When the BBC is created in the 20s and 30s, they're not talking so much about, the purity of the information. They're talking about how do we create a space where society can have an informed debate. Yeah, it's creating a forum. So there's someone who has to do that as well. So there are all these things that need to be done. And it's up to, it's up to you to choose which one of those journalisms you want to do. And if you want to hold on to the word journalism just for one of them, that's fine. We'll call the other thing something else.
So basically what you're saying is that, number one, understand your audience and their motivations, and then address those motivations before propaganda does. There's that small caveat of how can I reach them when TikTok and Zuckerberg and Musk are just really, really trying to make that part of the job difficult. But that's for us to figure out. You've touched on this before tonight.
Well, it's not just for us to figure out. Regulation can play a role. This is where regulation does play a role, and where maybe the EU still has a chance, because this is just happening. So the Digital Service Act, the EU regulatory body, has at its best, and it's a very confused document, the Digital Service Act, but at its best, it is about transparency. Yeah? I mean, this morning I saw a presentation about TikTok in Romania, and the real problem is the total lack of transparency. Suddenly this candidate gets this huge boost of followers. Who the hell are they? Are they real? Is it organic? Is it the Russians? Is it the Chinese? Is it the Pekingese? We don't know. Society cannot live as a democracy with that lack of transparency. We have to understand what is Facebook pushing up and down. Yeah? We have to understand where before we can do fact checking, we have to understand who's consuming the fake news in the first place. How do we know who to reach? At the moment, we give the fact checks to Facebook and hope they do something about it. They're not even doing that anymore. But the whole thing is behind a curtain. So the best bits of the Digital Services Act are stripping that away. And we're about to have the first legal challenges to Elon Musk's company X, saying you have to start revealing how your algorithm is prioritizing one content or another. Are you making political decisions? And if you're making political decisions, how the hell do we start regulating that? So, no, the transparency will help. The transparency will help us understand how information is flowing, where it's being stressed, whether we need some sort of counterbalance to that, whether we should then, look, if we're saying that these companies are essentially political weapons, which are being weaponized by the Chinese Communist Party, by Elon Musk, then we have to start asking, okay, do we need a balance to that? Do we have something else that we do? Do we mitigate their access and what they can do if they are just political tools? Do we start regulating them as political tools? And so on and so forth. So no, regulation can create a more transparent space, a more balanced space, and a space where we have a chance. But then we have to do the rest. Regulation will not solve the problem of people liking crazy conspiracy theories, because they like them for deep, deep psychological reasons that Delmer understood.
Right. Regulation and transparency would definitely help, but you brought up the presentation this morning, which, to summarize, said, you know, the authorities here aren't exactly competent, transparent themselves, or, you know, seem to understand what is going on. Like, the elections, as you learned this morning, the presidential elections were annulled because of Russian influence. Now, what that Russian influence, nobody in power can really tell us, which of course is making the people who voted for the guy angrier. So my question to you, like, as a member of the public this time, not a journalist, if I look at what happened to Călin Georgescu's ascent, I will say, well, it kind of looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, so it must be a duck when considering Russian influence. What would you say are the telltale signs that, you know, could strongly lead us to believe that, yes, Russia played a part in this? Or maybe, you know, you don't think it did?
So I haven't seen the data, and you know, I mean, what I heard today, there was presentations this morning that we both watched about like the lack of transparency on TikTok, and then the other side, the lack of clarity, and in a sense, transparency from the courts and the government. So it is like a clusterfuck of democracy literally here dying in darkness, yeah? All I can say is we saw this play out in America with Russian intervention around Trump. And for somebody like me who is very hawkish on Russia and really wants to see Putin destroyed, what happened in America was terrible. The way that, you know, the way that everybody just started looking for this Russian conspiracy about Trump instead of actually dealing with his appeal, the way the Russia issue became polarizing and partisan. So it didn't become an attack on democracy, it became about my candidate versus your candidate, was the single biggest favor to Putin that one can imagine. So this is the wonderful position the Russians are in. They throw these stink bombs into democracies. If their candidate gets in, great. If the way the situation is handled increases polarization and makes half the country who never liked Russia really like Russia, they win as well. So just don't be like the Americans. They fucked up the response so badly, they made things much, much, much worse. So just be aware, you know, if the point of these operations that Russia does is to A, bring their candidate to power, but B, fuck up society. I mean, they're like, you know, what was her name? Eris and the apple, throwing it into the dinner party at the start of the Iliad. So just be very aware of what they're trying to do. So America is just such a cautionary tale of how not to deal with the situation. So I hope you don't end up doing the same thing.
That makes two of us.
Yeah.
I'll end on a personal note because you know, basically describe the clusterfuck that we're in, and I wholeheartedly agree. Then we'll take questions from the audience, just to be clear. We have about half an hour to do that. But my final question to you, in this clusterfuck of sorts, what makes you hang on to a bit of optimism, maybe, or hope?
So I go to Ukraine a lot, and what's nice is when you get to Ukraine, when you cross the border, is that a lot of these questions become clearer. You know, it's just really clear what you're up against. There isn't this sense of confusion. You know? Evil is so close that you see its face. And I learn from my Ukrainian friends. You know, people keep on asking, what's it like in Ukraine? I'm like, people are just focused on surviving and winning. My girlfriend always talks about doomed optimism that Ukrainians have. And I think that's a good way of putting it. I think it does help to just embrace the fact that the old world is gone, and from now on it's hybrid war, information war, political war, real war. And once you kind of say, okay, that's where we're at, then something dies. Definitely the idyllic idea of the European Union that I was taught as a school child. And I went to a school designed by the EU to create the new EU generation. There's a special school I describe in my second book. That's clearly gone. It was probably never there. And I suppose we're a little bit like, you know, when I try to describe this new world to people, a lot of the time it's going to be like, you know, Eastern Europe in the 1990s, you know, Ukraine in the 1990s, Russia in the 1990s, no rules. Occasionally a rule pops up. Sometimes there's even a court case, which is quite virtuous, but most things are very corrupt. You know, belonging matters a lot. It doesn't mean idealism has died. You find romantics fighting for a true cause, a lot of cynics, a lot of cults, a lot of mafia. Power, hard power will matter a lot, and playing power off each other and getting them to fight with each other and shoot each other a lot of the time. So once you embrace that and you're like, that's where we are, switch on Eastern Europe in the 1990s as the whole world. A friend of mine just came back from Darfur. Sudan is not an exception. Sudan is the essence of where we're at. No rules. The international order is gone. Vicious genocidal war where each side is just, you know, a warlord. And in all of that, we find beauty and we find truth again. I mean, I think once you embrace that's where we're at, it's easier because then you don't get really upset when the far right starts winning elections everywhere.
And on that optimistic note, I mean, okay, the silver lining that I will see is that I survived the 90s in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, no, and actually maybe the cycle is these. So I was telling that to my friends in Ukraine, and they're like, but we're not in the 1990s of Ukraine anymore. You guys are. Like, I'm like the way I negotiate America, it's 1996, like, you know, Russian elections. And she was like, but we're not in the 90s. We outgrew that. And I was like, so again, Ukraine, Romania, Bukovina is our hope. You survived it.
I did, some didn't, but we'll talk about that some other time. Thank you, Peter. I will now take questions from the audience, so I'll be walking around with a mic. I won't be walking around with a mic.
You said that part of liberal media is in a kind of echo chamber at the moment, and maybe in the past, and also that Delmore in your book used some sort of dirty tricks to try and influence the German people. Is there a way to use his kind of doppelganger style in Russia to try and influence common Russian people
Is that something that maybe should be done, or should be done in a different way? And is it possible even to get through to those people?
Yeah, it should be done, and if we were fighting Russia properly, it wouldn't even be a question. So it's absurd that we're not. Of course, there should be a huge media campaign targeting Russian soldiers and their families. It's a no-brainer for me, and very disappointing that it hasn't been done yet. But I just want to pause on this about Delmer and dirty tricks. So Delmer uses the word tricks a lot about himself. And I kind of dwelled on it. He keeps on saying, using the word trick. But that word is an exciting word. He's, in mythology, we talk about trickster gods. Hermes, or Hermes, I don't know how you say it now. Loki in the Norse mythology, all the trickster gods of the Native American tradition. And he's a trickster god in the sense that his role is to explode and subvert the sort of frozen and despotic hold that a Putin propaganda or a Hitler propaganda has, explode it, and to get people into a situation where they can start thinking and feeling freely again. So tricks is a positive thing. There's a lovely book called Trickster Makes the World, which is a lovely kind of anthropological analysis of the trickster god as the first storyteller. Yeah? And this old paradox that everybody from the arts knows, that you know, artists use lies to tell the truth. I mean, Delmer is playing with those sorts of concepts a lot. So dirty tricks aren't demeaning. Tricks can be very, very liberating. They're also chaotic. The trickster god is always getting into trouble, causing chaos, all sorts of unintended consequences. But he's always the god in mythology that starts life. Yeah? So Delmer was about that. Delmer was about, you know, flipping people's psyches in a way that they start thinking and feeling freely again. So can you do that to the Russians? Definitely. Our aim, though, at the moment, isn't to dream of a democratic Russia led by brave dissidents. That's wonderful. And maybe that will happen one day. I'd love to be able to see that. But the aim right now is to be like Delmer, to make sure Russian soldiers fight badly, to make sure that mothers decide not to send their sons to war, not out of idealism, but out of disruption, tricks, and really tapping into what they really want. So of course we should be doing that, and it's frankly absurd that we haven't.
Why do you think the dominant sense, so you talk about liberals as a kind of group, why do you think the dominant sense now is that the liberals are elites who are perhaps nostalgic for a time of truth? And a sort of time of truth, I think, as you referred to it, going back to truth. Why do you think that has become the sense, is that the liberals are elite and out of touch, and like as Dominic Cummings describes, like narrative whiplash, like unable to engage with the rest of the populace? Why do you think that has emerged as the narrative? Do you think it's true?
Yeah, Dominic Cummings. It's a really good question, and why are they called liberals? I can't think of a clever answer. Let's take some more questions. That's such a good question. Then let me think about it, because my last book was about that in many ways. I don't know why, but in the sense that liberalism was about, I mean, it was actually summed up in the EU's credo more than anything else, you know. If we think of liberalism as sort of deeply connected to notions of freedom, so the EU's thing of like freedom of movement, freedom of travel, freedom of markets. If we're thinking of that as, you know, peak liberal credo, it was in a, I mean, let's think. I mean, at one point it just became kind of empty. at one point it stopped having its sort of like powerful sense of being liberating. You know, it was liberalism without feeling liberating anymore. It was sort of just like working in its own logic. And at the end of the day, I mean, let's center it on the EU, because that was really the home of that story. I think it was always very dependent on being in a relationship with totalitarianism. When it had not the history of totalitarianism in Europe, Russian authoritarianism, it existed. It could have had its power from that. Its great heroes were Václav Havel or my parents' generation, and then at one point it stopped being heroic. At one point it stopped having that drive, and it just became kind of empty and maybe in some ways corrupt and self-serving. And in terms of a piece of storytelling, I'm very much a child of that story, but we haven't had a good story since 1989. We've had remakes of 1989, yeah? We've had, repeats of it in Georgia, in some ways in the Middle East, in the Arab Spring, but they were repeats of the Berlin Wall falling, They were just repeats of that over and over and over again. I was just in South Africa, and there it's the most painful place that I've seen it, actually, because on the one hand, South Africa is still completely gripped with the narrative of, well, for them it was a few years later, but, liberation from apartheid. And it's everywhere. Statues of Mandela, it's in every event you go to, it's everywhere, the cult of that story, the repeat of that story, told in endless repeat and over again, and around it the society has become horrendously corrupt and unequal, just horrendously corrupt and unequal, and increasingly in bed with Chinese money. I mean, the Chinese now own a lot of the big media there, who quietly self-censor stuff about China. And just this horrible tension between the constant evocation of the struggle against apartheid and the current epic corruption and cynicism. I mean, there's nothing that undercuts the former than the result of the latter. And yeah, so that's what happened. That's how it happened. Why it happened? What I suppose Cummings is talking about, or rather what Cummings has exploited, is that when that became the only narrative in town, which it kind of did in the 1990s, and with Tony Blair saying that, globalization is like the weather, we have no other choice, then it created a space that any kind of opposition to that could be owned by quite demonic forces. Yeah, when that became the only political discourse in town, that means anyone who felt resentment to that in any way at all could be exploited by Dominic Cummings, who has been a very effective destructive force in global politics, I think. So that was what happened, and that's how it was taken advantage of. I don't think I have a final answer about why it happened, but let me think about that.
I will say that I find it interesting that both questions were from Brits. And also what you said about apartheid, I think sort of harkens to what we see in Romania, where the narrative of the great moment of 1989 and the revolution is just this watershed moment. And it's a great story that gets told every year around the same time, and people who live through it are getting fewer and fewer, and it's sort of an empty signifier of sorts for people who are just...
Because I have a friend of mine who's thinking about writing a big history of 1989. So do we need to go back to it and re-examine it in a less sentimental and in a less sort of like iconic way, and really start to examine it and maybe tell a lot of the stories that were untold? Do you think that's what we need?
I think that's an ambitious plan, and I think it could be a part of what we need. But to specifically speak of Romania, we've never had a reckoning with the previous regime, so I think we might need a bit of both. Perhaps some sort of polyphonic project exploring all sorts of stories from that time, like you have in Secondhand Times by Svetlana Alexievich on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah, perhaps that would be interesting. But I would struggle to see who would be able to undertake such a project. Perhaps they are out there.
So, do you believe that the West will use Sefton-Delmer's tactics on the authoritarian world, or will they resort to more conventional ways?
So you're making the assumption that democracies are going to do anything. So there's a very big chance they're going to do nothing. So if they use more conventional ways, like mass funding of independent media, I'm happy. If they want to be really clever, they can start to think about some of Sefton-Delmer's tactics. My huge worry is they're not going to do anything. And that they will just retreat. So I just want them to do something. Let's start with that, because at the moment we're not doing anything.
But in the end, do you believe that the West will and the EU, European Union, will regroup and win, or will we enter a new authoritarian world?
I don't know if we'll go full authoritarian. I think it's worth thinking about authoritarian practices rather than authoritarian systems. So more corruption, more exploitation of law courts, etc., etc., etc. So more non-democratic practices in democracies. I don't think we're in a world of very many top-down systems. But we're not fighting yet. You have more recognition that there might be a fight to have. But my worry, I have a weird worry with Trump. I mean, I have many worries with Trump. But actually, it's very interesting. If you listen to him, he talks about strength. So you're like, okay, well, maybe that strength can be channeled into something good, you know. You know, it's like getting the sort of the mafia boss to kind of, can you go and fight that mafia boss? But if you listen to him, he doesn't actually like to fight. He always hated violence. He avoided the army. He hates soldiers, yeah? At a time when maybe we can love some soldiers. He always wants to compromise and kind of get down on what he thinks is a deal, but everybody else knows is one knee in front of Putin and Xi Jinping. He might be a weakling and not courageous at all. And my worry actually is not that he's like a big bully ready to fight, that actually he's a conformist and he won't fight. And if America doesn't do anything, and in Europe, well, the Poles always fight, and we know how that always ends. So it'll be Poles and Ukrainians fighting to the end, because that's what they always do, but the track record is not always victorious. Britain is bankrupt. I don't know. It's actually very worrying. It's actually very worrying. And that doesn't mean there'll be dictatorships here or anything like that. It'll just be like, you know when you have a bar of soap that comes apart, just flakes into little bits, and before you know it, it's gone. So it'll be that process.
Recording, yeah. No worries.
Peter, hi. Thanks for the conference. Do you think our societies, free societies, would be better protected from misinformation if the forward share functions of the social media networks would be disabled?
Which functions?
Forward share functions of the social media networks to be disabled so that we stop the chain of spreading misinformation, like fencing a regulation for that matter. Because a lot of misinformation is spread. I have the example of my mother. I gave her a smartphone in 2019, and she's a fascist now.
Well, look, you're right that the design of the design of technology is a choice. Yeah, you can design it one way or another way. The simplicity of this ancient Roman sign from the Colosseum, like, don't like. I mean, already that's literally from like a very primitive, crowd-like moment. It's not designed for like subtle and nuanced debate. So you're quite right that the technology and the design influences democracy. I don't know if it's about the share button. I also don't think the problem is misinformation. I think the problem is models of identity, an identity that's open to dialogue and listening, and those other democratic characteristics, or a personality and an identity that's based on humiliating others. So I think we sometimes misdiagnose this about being information versus disinformation when it's about a fascist psychology and the thing that stops a fascist psychology. So that would be my one doubt, but you're quite right. The design of media, and especially this technology, is very, very important. And the way we think about the design is very important. Look, there's loads of ideas about how you redesign interfaces, how you redesign the feeds. So maybe go and test it in a study. I mean, we need to test all these things. I don't know. We have all these assumptions. You know, we can test them in media research. That's why there are communications departments. I think you're right that the design is very important. I don't know if that could be one of the 300,000 different solutions that we need. We definitely need to start thinking about design and its relationship to democracy. I mean, one of the ways we should start thinking about is having people who study computer science go through courses about democracy. What's very clear listening to Musk and Zuckerberg and all these guys is they do not understand what freedom of speech is. They actually don't understand it. They have no idea what they're talking about. So maybe one thing is we should start to make sure that everyone who does physics, computer science, takes courses on Habermas and Aristotle and all that. So there's so many things that we need to reform in that sense.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech. I was just wondering, adding up to the idea of liberty, and do you think it's possible that maybe the promise of liberty didn't offer us enough security? Yeah. In order, maybe that right now we're living in a society of more precarity than ever. Like we're living from day to day in a way like it doesn't matter where we are. We can be like, to get a tenure, it's complicated, so thank you.
Yeah. So I'm not a... Look, I'm a writer. I have a PhD, but it's in creative writing. So like I think about stories and stuff like that. But so Tim Snyder's got a whole book about it called On Freedom. And there are people who are much better at these philosophical concepts than I am. There's many things I like about... There's many things I find interesting in Freud's writings. I mean, I'm not a Freudian, but I find actually like his crazy ideas quite inspiring and quite insightful. The least good idea he had was about freedom and security being opposites. That is utter bullshit. The only way is to guarantee your security is by being free. So when my parents grew up in the Soviet Union and we all lived in these regimes, we had no freedom and we had security? No, we had the security services. We had no. So freedom is the only guarantee of security. And security has to be there to guarantee freedom. So this idea that they're different and that they're opposites, I just think is just ridiculous. The other thing I really get pissed off about is Aristotle. And his whole thing that logos and pathos are opposed. only an emotionally, I don't know, an emotionally retarded academic like Aristotle could come up with such an idiotic idea. Like, here is good logos, good rational thinking that us in the academy like, and there below is dirty pathos, the evil emotions that are opposed to them. Like, what utter bullshit. Every great story is about pathos. It's only about getting the right emotions that you can have a conversation about the truth. All the great art in history, which communicates more truth than anything academia produced, is all about engaging the emotions. So logos and pathos go together. Freedom and security go together. So let's not fall into these weird traps. I just reject them wholeheartedly.
I'm in grade 12 right now, and for the past 4 years I've been studying in an IB school, but before that I've been in a public school. And I was very privileged in my first year when I got to the international school. I had a unit in humanities about media literacy, and I remember in public school we didn't do anything like that. In public school no one ever mentioned critical thinking, and this year was the first time I ever voted. And I have a lot of my friends who also voted and had no idea who they were voting for. They were highly influenced by TikTok, by social media. They had no idea what was happening in the political world. In Romania, in the Romanian public system, politics is considered to be a taboo subject. It's not discussed at all. And given the journalists in Romania, all of the publications that are, everyone knows, they support either a party or another, or right now it's pro-Georgescu or anti-Georgescu. I'm wondering, what do you envision for the educational system in Romania? What should we do in order to prepare the future generation to be more informed and to make better political decisions?
So I don't know enough about media literacy in Romania or anywhere. It's a very specialized subject. The one thing so we had media literacy in schools, and we looked at advertisements, and I think it was very helpful, helped critical thinking. I think the very important thing with media literacy, and I'm sure the experts who teach it are aware of this, the danger with it can also give a lot of cynicism. Because if you're constantly just going, oh, this is a manipulation, you can actually end up in a very cynical space. So I think as we approach it, it can't just be about criticism, it's got to be about, so what is a good conversation? So fine, this is manipulative, so what is a positive conversation? What is actually an engagement that's good for democracy? So it can't just be about analyzing, it's also got to be about engaging. So that's my only caution with it, because I do see the students that I'm getting at Hopkins, they're actually very good at analyzing what they see online, but they're so cynical, yeah? They're post-culture wars. They think culture wars are for the generation above them. So they're not into kind of wokeism. It's very interesting. They're the next generation. Nor are they into the kind of right-wing stuff either, because they just see that as a game between each other. But they're just super cynical about everything, like very, very cynical. So that's not healthy either. So they've learned to analyze everything. They think everything is manipulation. Everything they live in a Delma world. They're when I tell them about Delma, they're like, yeah, of course, that's what everybody does online. They're completely chill with it. But they don't have an idea of the good. So that worries me a little bit.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, just so everybody knows.
Thank you for your speech. What do you think is the sociological explanation for what seems like a counteroffensive of the oligarchs in the free world, especially against their own peoples, sometimes inspired by Russia? Do you think there is a sociological explanation, or what's happening?
Which oligarchs?
Sorry?
Which ones? Where?
So if there is an explanation, a logical explanation for the counteroffensive of the oligarchs around the world, the free world, who are trying to get into power, to get back the power, or to get into power, like for example, in the USA with Trump, in Israel with Netanyahu, in France with Le Pen, and in Italy with Salvini, and so on.
I don't know if they're oligarchs. I mean, I think, let's talk about Russia first. So I'm not a sociologist, so I don't know if I have a sociological explanation. But Firstly, in Russia, the only time you had oligarchs was 96. There you really have a bunch of tycoons who sit down and say, we are going to rig the election for Yeltsin in order to then have economic and political power. You know, that is a class of very rich people who decide to use their money together in a strategic way to take over the state. From 2000, you don't have oligarchs. Putin is the oligarch. There's one, you know, and he takes everybody else as a tycoon. The oligarchs have no power. We keep on calling them that when they're not. They're tycoons, they're bureaucrats who use their money to give to Putin, but there's no oligarchy in Russia since 2000. 96 was an oligarchy, that's it. I'm not sure I see the accusation from bits of the new right in America that we've had an oligarchy so far in America, and Trump is there to break free of it. Yeah? I don't know, that seems a very, that's a very fashionable argument among the American new right. Yeah? That we've had an oligarchy of Wall Street, you know, the big companies, and together, you know, they've had such a hold on whoever was in power that you could never do any change. And now finally Trump has come to set us free of this oligarchy, and the true voice of the people will emerge. So those are the kind of, you know, things that are used. I think what we are seeing, though, maybe you mean this, is the return of like the great man, this 19th century great man, a Musk, you know, a Trump, a Putin, who are bigger than states, bigger than history, who stride across the stage of the world and dominate it. So this, you know, the return of these Nietzschean, I can't even call them supermen, kind of super babies. So we do see a return of that, and that's very interesting. Why is that happening? That's definitely happening. It probably says a lot about men, that men need these weird leaders. Probably says a lot about sort of weird economies where somebody like Musk can, without really producing very much, by the way, you know, his car company is no more successful than Toyota, but he is earning way more than Toyota and has a hold over the American imagination that is quite epic. So some desire to have these kind of like economic superheroes. I mean, there is something weird going on, yeah, where there is a desire to see superheroes in these figures. But yeah, no, you're right. There's something going on. I can't fully explain it.
I think that was it.
There's one more question.
Yeah. Alberto?
And maybe I can end on a positive note. Thank you for being here in this very interesting climate we're having from many of respects here in Romania. You mentioned at the beginning of your conversation that we're kind of lacking into creativity or imagination, right? And then the importance of storytelling and how that makes us human again. And then I was thinking that far right, what the far right does right now is like selling a story, right? That people tend to believe. And then I'm wondering, are we now as liberals lacking this kind of imagination? To quote on Fukuyama, is it true that we reach the end of our imagination, or is just something, I don't know, should we be more utopians, dreaming utopians in this respect and counteract that story back again? It feels like we don't have anything of the good story to combat that.
Yeah, no, they're totally winning. They're totally winning. And again, look, I'm not the first person to remark on it. It was telling that for a long time, the only heroes in Hollywood films were the baddies, and all the successful TV series were about negative characters. And in reality shows that I worked in when I was much younger in my first book, it was all about the bad guy. We could no longer generate a good, you know. And, you know, there's been lots of remarks about Trump's victory, that Americans have believed their kind of TV series about the Sopranos and Walter White a little bit too literally. I mean, he literally plays the music from, like, The Undertaker, who was a negative character in Worldwide Wrestling. I don't know. Okay. This is very 1990s. But he literally is saying, I am the bad guy. You know, I am the bad guy come to, you know, fuck up a dark and evil world. So yeah, they've got there's a cult of the bad guy. And you're right, the authoritarian narrative is so effective because it starts from somewhere very, very deep. Like, they are taking something away from me. You know, mummy is leaving me. They're taking away my thing. We're going to be, you know, strong and together and punish them, whether it's my country, my economy, my vote. They've stolen my vote. It's so effective, you know, and it works on an emotional level. It works on a political level. It doesn't have much of an idea of the future, but it has nostalgias. It can be uplifting, by the way. You know, it can be inspiring. No, they've completely taken all the stories over. Yeah, we have to go back to almost a communal storytelling, which means listening to people's concerns again, psychological concerns, and going from there. I've been doing a lot of sort of focus groups with Americans and what they feel about foreign policy. And without a doubt, the authoritarian narrative is very seductive. People don't understand. People have no story of American history having progress, let alone the world having a story. It seems to them just a crazy dog-eat-dog world. They have no idea why America should get involved in it. There's no idea of a Pax Americana that America is constructing, like all of that. They just look at you like crazy when you talk about that. They don't understand why America's there. Sometimes they feel you should go and help Ukrainians, go and help these out of emotions. Last 5 minutes, and they're like, what are we doing this for? Total confusion. And in that confusion, we hunker down, we do our own, we punish others, becomes a way of making sense of the world. There's still a desire for primacy, to feel strong, so you bully Denmark, you bully Panama, that makes you feel good. So that sort of narrative, which is authoritarian in its shape, doesn't have to be in its policies concretely. I'm not saying you're about to have an authoritarian regime, but definitely authoritarian in its psychology and in the shape of the narrative. That is very popular. The only hopeful thing I'll say is when you talk to people, they know it's bullshit. Yeah? They know that actually that doesn't get you anywhere. They know it's a delusion. You know, when you go, you know, they'll even say, look, I'd love us to just cut off the world, but I know we can't really. I know we need friends. And then you ask about, like, well, are there threats in the world? They go, yeah, Russia, China, we should probably do something about them. And they don't like corruption, really, actually. So at some level, they know it's bullshit. They know it's the illusion of a solution. So there's something to work with there. But yes, the world has to be re-explained. I'm just talking about Americans and their relationship with the world. That's the only thing I'm talking about now. The world needs to be re-explained, and why America has to be engaged with it has to be re-explained from scratch. But yeah, no, at the moment, it's, you know, we even asked in the focus groups, so let's say America retreats from the world, what will happen? And they're like, oh, it'll burn. And we're like, well, is that bad? They're like, yeah, it's not great, but what you going to do?
Thank you so much. I mean, we're ending with the world burning, so I don't know what to make of that.
The self-perception of Americans it'll burn. I mean, you know.
Thank you, Peter, so much. And don't forget to buy this man's books. They're on the table at the back. Thank you, and have a great evening.